Welcome back. This is Prime Time with me, James Max. Now, the government has failed to guarantee it'll pass its manifesto pledge to end no-fault evictions for renters, at least before the election. Housing Secretary Michael Gove made the comments as he faced a Tory rebellion against his renters reform bill back in Parliament today. For more on this, I'm joined by former Housing Minister and serving Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, Rachel Maclean. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, look, we know that we're trying to see changes in the legislation. We're trying to see changes in this eviction pledge. But it seems to be going wrong, isn't it? Or is the government getting its way?
No, that look, any process of legislation, especially when you're dealing with millions of people who are now landlords, is complex. And you need to do it step by step. You need to put in place the legal scaffolding and the pathway to make this work out in the country. It's not really just a matter of the debates in Parliament today. It's when do you actually enact those measures that will have a real impact on people who are landlords. So we started on that path. And obviously the government will continue to do that. I think the key part that I think people have picked up on is this issue of doing the review into the courts. And I think that's a good idea, because the main thing that people were worried about if they are renting property is the ability to get their property back, which of course is very important, and it affects confidence in the entire rental market. So you need to have that confidence there to underpin a flourishing rental market. So I think that's quite sensible. The government's taking its time to do that properly.
What do you say to those who are landlords who say that the government have messed around and tinkered, they've made renting difficult, they've applied taxation and rules and regulation and red tape, made it extremely difficult for them when you've already taken money in tax out of their pensions, so they've switched into buying houses to let to perhaps students or to others, making a functioning renting market. You've made it more difficult for them. You've applied all sorts of changes and it's an impossible situation. You've messed up the housing market. You've messed up this bill. You've made a complete and utter mess of everything involved.
If that was the case, there wouldn't be a growing number of people wanting to rent property. Renting property is something that people go into because they make money. We live in a market economy. People are free to do what they want with their own assets, their own property. I think you're talking about an awful lot of things that happened way before I was an MP under previous iterations of governments, and some of which I don't agree with. I think they were, they were wrong. And, I would like to see some of these things reversed. But look, we are where we are. We are, 14 years into this government.
Sorry, we're 14 years into this government and we're 16 or however many housing ministers in. You don't take it seriously. There's no continuity. You haven't taken advantage of the fact that you've been in power, and you've ignored housing, you've ignored the property market, you've ignored the property industry, and you've just done what the heck you like. It's no wonder it's a mess.
Well, I utterly reject that kind of barrage of negativity, James, which I know
that's
obviously that's what you'll put to me, I'm sure. But I do reject all of that, because housing has been a central part of the government's agenda. But look, on this bill, I think we do need to think very carefully about how we do it. There are a lot of people in this country who have put money into property, who are pensioners. There are lots of people who are what we call accidental landlords, who are people who are sort of between situations, selling a house, buying a house, forming relationships and so on. And the last thing we want to do is damage their confidence in the market, because ultimately that will hurt renters. So it's right that this is done carefully. And I think, just to sort of push back a bit on your very sort of critical laundry list there, James. This was a manifesto pledge that we were all elected on. It's a manifesto pledge, and we've delivered it. We put in place the legal underpinning.
You say you delivered it, but John Bird, who says the bill in its current form is a complete failure.
Now, who's John Bird?
So John Bird is the founder of The Big Issue. He's been pushing for a whole range of issues relating to renters. He's been an extremely loud voice, and if you listen to anybody in the property industry, they'll also tell you that the government has failed on property. You failed on the industry.
No, they don't. You've just, with respect, you've given one individual. You can find many people who will criticise government policy. One voice doesn't mean the policy is wrong. I could also.
Well, then let's bring in another voice. I assume Rachel. We'll come back to you in a minute, Rachel. We'll come back to you in a minute, Rachel.
Perhaps you'll just let me to put my rebuttal to you, which you've put an accusation to me. You cited one person who I don't think has ever supported a single Conservative government policy from what you've told me about him. So it's hardly a great surprise.
Well, then I'll just speak. Rachel. I'll just speak from a personal point of view. I've spent 20 years in the property industry and another 20 years advising the property industry, and all I can tell you is, you speak to anybody in it, they'll tell you you've made an utter mess. It's an absolute travesty. It's a travesty.
Well, you're very welcome to have your opinion, but I can tell you I have probably spoken. I'm very happy to compare how many people we've each spoken to. I don't think that gets us anywhere. I was the housing minister. I spoke to hundreds, thousands of people. My records are publicly available under any kind of freedom of information. I've spoken to all the major groups. Many of the landlords groups are very happy with this. So are some of the charitable organisations. So are some of the local government organisations. So are the housing.
Rachel, I'm going to. Sorry to cut over you. I'm going to come back to you in a minute. However, just joining him in the studio is Harry Scoffin, housing campaigner. So listen, you've heard what Rachel McLean has to say. Look, the government are going to put up a strong rebuttal. They're going to say that they're the party of housing. They're going to be talking about the reforms that they brought in. They're going to talk about election manifesto pledges. In terms of this legislation, does it fail or does it pass in terms of your expertise or your input?
Well, you mentioned John Bird, big issue. I've got a lot of time for that guy. I've met him. He's a lovely guy and he's very focused on homelessness, but he's got a passion about the rental market. The fact is that a number of groups have pulled support from this renters reform bill, not just John Bird and the big issue. You've also got renters' interests, and I know there are landlord interests that are also saying the bill is confiscatory, it's hard on them. But I represent a group called Free Leaseholders. There's 5.3 million leaseholders in England and Wales. It's shooting up the political agenda. That is another bit of legislation where the rhetoric is very strong from the government, but when it comes to the actual delivery, there's a disconnect.
But let me ask you about that, because there are some people who seem to think that every kind of leasehold is wrong. And in fact, there is a huge amount of value of having freeholds and leaseholds if they're governed properly. And if people are not going into a property deal properly and well-versed and understanding what they're buying into, and also that there is a value sometimes in having, say, for example, a management company that is able to control behaviours, able to control planning, able to control how a place looks, how it's run, how it's secured, all of those things, that just because you got freehold ownership doesn't necessarily make it better. So there are some aspects that people have been pushing for, saying landlords are terrible. There are some amazing landlords out there, and if we're not careful, the law of unintended consequence means that you might end up with a worse position.
You know what? I'm going to make a distinction between the private rented sector, where there are good landlords out there, they provide a service, they own a property, they pay for upkeep, and then the leasehold sector, where these freeholders are rentiers that don't pay a service charge, they own 2.5% capital value in a block of flats, and they're middlemen. They've inserted themselves into our homes, and the rest of the world doesn't have this leasehold system. And I'm not going to go there about feudal, and it's unfair. But the idea that you pay a premium for your home, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds, and you can't take back control, it's absurd.
But sometimes, though, people will say, but that's your choice. As a buyer, that's your choice to decide what sort of investment you want to make.
No, because it's not. It's a forced condition of sale. The only way you can buy a flat in this country is leasehold. You've not got a choice. Developers say, well, it's going to be leasehold. And if you want a flat, and yes, flats are cheaper than houses, but that's in most markets, there's a gap. The fact is, why can't we have freehold ownership? Like my generations, your generation, you all took it for granted. We want to own a freehold flat, whether it's common hold or even will compromise leasehold of a share of the freehold. And on that, we heard last year...
Because I could understand that, and I think that the point is that what we haven't done is we haven't amended. So when we go back to government legislation and where they've failed, part of the problem is, in my view, is that they've made finance very difficult, they've added stamp duty on, and they've also taxed the people who are taking the risk. So if you're building a block of flats, then and you're taking away and you're providing Section 106 agreements and all these other things, and sills and CBILS and all this other stuff that they throw in, which is basically taking money out of the developer. The developer says, I've got to get my return because my investors say I've got to get a return. So this is one way they've done it. Now, I think that's wrong, and I agree with you. I think common hold is a good way to do it, the way the French do it, where you have a say, but you still have the leasehold, so there's ultimate control in the unit, not the individual. There are all sorts of ways to do it, but the government seem to have missed the point.
Yeah, because on new flats, they're not saying, right, If we can't do common hold, we're going to say share of the freehold, because the government banned ground rents 2 years ago. So the idea that most of the financial value has been drained.
So one message to government, if they could do one thing, because Rachel's still with us, if they could do one thing, what would it be?
All new leasehold flats come with a share of the freehold. The answer to the problem isn't to create more of the problem.
There we go. Harry Scoffin, thank you very much indeed, housing campaigner. Thank you for joining us. So let's go back to Rachel, if I may. So, Rachel, look, it's not just me who has problems with this. And look, I know I'm having a go, but I'm having a go because I'm frustrated. The Conservative Party is supposed to be, or was historically, the party of home ownership. It was the party that really gave rights to individuals. It was the party that gave hope and aspiration that you could buy your home and you could have it. It was the party that gave aspiration that maybe if you did really well, you could have 2 homes. And yet here we have Michael Gove, who's brought in this legislation allowing councils to double council tax, to stuff individuals who have worked hard throughout their lives. And then what happens? They pass it on to the renters, or they bring in Airbnb. You know, you're just ignoring the people who you're supposed to be looking after.
I just don't agree with your characterization. I mean, you are, as you said, you're in the industry, so you have a very well informed view of the perspective of the people who own these properties. So we have to think about everybody in the country, including renters, and we do need to make the system fairer for renters, and we need to do that in conjunction with making it fairer and better for landlords too. So look, we have no government is perfect, no legislation is perfect, but the reason why this is taking some time is because it affects so many people.
It does,
we have so many people
it
now
does affect a lot of people.
Which is why we have to take it step by step in a sequential manner and implement it consistently with the capacity in the criminal justice system and so on, so that landlords have got the confidence to rent their properties out.
All I could say is please listen to the voters. Please listen to the property industry, and we might get somewhere.
We are the ones that are elected, so we spend a heck of a lot of time listening to voters.
Arguably, if it keeps going like this, not for long. Rachel, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Rachel McLean, MP, former Housing Minister, giving a robust defence of the government's position on housing. I could say a thing or two. Anyway, I better shut up now because we must move on.